History remembers the Mongols as killers. We picture them as a relentless tide of horsemen, burning cities to the ground and building gruesome pyramids of human skulls. And yes, they absolutely did that. The terror was real. But if you stop there, if you only see the destruction, you miss the real story. You miss one of the most incredible, world-changing events in human history. Because Genghis Khan didn't just conquer the world, he connected it. He and his descendants built the internet of the 13th century. They created a zone of safety so massive, so unprecedented, that it was said a virgin carrying a sack of gold could walk from the Pacific Ocean all the way to the Black Sea without ever being harmed. This is the story of the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. A peace forged in blood and fire, but one that paved the way for the very first global economy. Before the Mongols, the legendary Silk Road was mostly just that, a legend. In reality, it was a death trap. It wasn't a single road, but a fragmented, treacherous network of paths broken up by dozens of tiny kingdoms and warring tribes. Each one had its own greedy ruler, its own exorbitant taxes, its own local bandits, and its own petty wars. Trying to move goods was a nightmare. Trade was slow, prohibitively expensive, and incredibly dangerous. Most merchants never made it. Then came the horsemen. When the Mongol armies thundered into a city, their reputation preceded them. But what happened after the conquest is what truly changed the world. They didn't just loot it and leave. They integrated it. They absorbed it into a single, unified system. For the first time in human history, the entire sprawling trade network of Asia was under one management. Imagine driving from Portugal all the way to Vietnam today without ever crossing a single border checkpoint. No passports, no customs, no different currencies. That's what the Mongol Empire felt like for a merchant in the 13th century. They slashed the crippling taxes that had strangled trade for centuries. They standardized weights and measures across the continent, so a pound of silk in China was still a pound of silk in Persia. They understood a profound truth that so many rulers before them had missed. Commerce, not plunder, was the true source of infinite wealth. But their greatest invention wasn't a weapon of war. It was a weapon of information. It was called the yam. Think of the Pony Express, but on a continental scale, supercharged with military discipline. Every 20 to 30 miles, stretching across the vast plains and mountains of Asia, the Mongols built a relay station. At every single station there were fresh, rested horses, hot food, and beds waiting. A Mongol rider carrying a specialized passport, a golden tablet called a paisa, was given absolute priority on the road. They could ride at a full gallop, swapping for a fresh mount at each station, covering up to 200 miles in a single day. Information that used to take months to travel now took mere days. Critical messages, military orders, and economic data flew across the empire at a speed that was almost supernatural for the time. The Great Khan, sitting in his capital in what is now Beijing, could know the price of grain in Baghdad before the local governors did. This incredible speed wasn't just for messages, it was the backbone of their entire economy. It allowed them to move resources, shift armies, and transfer money faster than anyone else on Earth. Now, the Mongols were nomadic warriors. They grew up on horseback, not in classrooms. Many, including Genghis Khan himself, were illiterate. But they were not stupid. They were keenly aware of what they didn't know. They knew they couldn't run a complex, continent-spanning economy on their own. So, they stole the people who could. What followed was perhaps the greatest brain drain in history. But it wasn't a drain in the modern sense. It was a forced relocation and redistribution of talent. If you were a brilliant accountant in Persia, a skilled engineer in China, a master silversmith in Russia, or a weaver in Damascus, you weren't just killed or enslaved. You were identified, valued, and hired. They brought Muslim financial administrators to China to completely overhaul the chaotic tax code. They sent Chinese engineers to the Middle East to build advanced irrigation systems and devastating siege weapons. They brought French goldsmiths to the Mongol capital of Karakorum. It was a forced cross-pollination of genius. Ideas, technologies, and cultures that had been separated by thousands of miles for centuries were suddenly thrown together. This created an economic and technological boom the world had never seen before. By the middle of the 1200s, the Mongols had it all. But they had a huge, unexpected problem. As trade exploded, they started running out of the one thing they needed to pay for it all: money. Specifically, copper coins. The economy was growing too fast for the physical money supply to keep up. You can't just mine more copper overnight. Caravans were getting bigger, and hauling around tons of metal coins was becoming impossible. They needed magic. And that magic would come from the mind of Genghis Khan's grandson, the great Kublai Khan. Imagine you're a European merchant in the year 1275. You walk into a bustling shop in China, ready to buy silk with your gold coins. But the shopkeeper laughs at your gold. Instead, he asks for a dirty, gray piece of paper. You think he's insane. Why would anyone trade luxurious silk for a flimsy piece of paper? But then he tells you, if you don't use this paper money, the emperor himself will have you killed. This was the chow, the world's first true fiat currency. It wasn't backed by gold or silver. The chow was money simply because the Khan declared it was money. Period. His word was law, and that law gave the paper its value. And incredibly, it worked. The government could suddenly pay its soldiers and builders without needing to mine a single ounce of copper. Marco Polo was stunned. He wrote that the Khan had mastered the alchemy of creating wealth out of mulberry bark. However, there is a fundamental, unbreakable rule in economics. If you make it easy to create money, it becomes incredibly difficult to stop spending it. Kublai Khan was the most powerful man in the world. He had the ultimate power, the printing press. But he also had an ego to match his empire. He looked across the sea towards Japan and thought, I want that too. He ordered the construction of a massive fleet, thousands of ships. He hired tens of thousands of sailors. And how did he pay for all this? He printed money. The fleet set sail, and a massive typhoon, the kamikaze, smashed it to pieces. An entire army gone. Most empires would stop, but Kublai was a Mongol. He ordered a second, even bigger fleet, and to pay for it, he fired up the printing presses again. The second fleet set sail, and another typhoon sent it to the bottom of the sea. Most leaders would have been ruined, but the Mongols thought they had a cheat code. They believed they could just print their way out of any problem. But when those fleets sank, the real wealth, the wood, the iron, the labor, was gone, destroyed. But the paper notes that paid for them, they were still circulating. This is classic inflation. Too much money chasing too few goods. Prices began to rise. To understand why they kept printing, you need to understand how the Mongol Empire had changed. Kublai's generation weren't nomads anymore. They were bureaucrats living in lavish palaces in Beijing. And palaces are expensive. To keep the Mongol nobility happy, the court sent them constant streams of gifts, silk, jewels, and cash. Let's call it what it was: bribery. As expenses grew, they started dipping into the reserves, the actual silver that was supposed to back the paper. Slowly, the trust began to erode. In 1287, they issued a new note and declared that one new note was worth 5 old notes. This was a devaluation. The government was effectively robbing the savers to pay for their failed wars. Corruption exploded. Finance ministers became like mob bosses, printing money to enrich themselves. People started hoarding real assets like silver and copper, burying them under floorboards, trying to get rid of their paper money as fast as possible. By the time Kublai Khan died in 1294, the cracks were visible. But the system was still holding together. Just barely. The Mongols were prepared for war. They were prepared for rebellion. But they weren't prepared for what came next: the Black Death. It traveled along the very same trade routes the Mongols had built. A cruel irony. It hitched a ride on the caravans, moving right into the heart of China. Historians estimate it killed 30% to 50% of the population. The economy collapsed. Agriculture died. The tax base evaporated. You can't tax dead people. But the emperor still had bills to pay. So, in a moment of total insanity, the government's response was to print more money. By 1350, the streets of Beijing were littered with cash, blowing around like worthless confetti. A wheelbarrow of money couldn't buy a bag of rice. The social contract was shattered. A peasant rebellion rose up, led by the Red Turbans. When these rebels captured a city, the first thing they did wasn't looting gold. They went to the government offices, took the tax records and the piles of paper money, and burned them in massive bonfires. It was a complete rejection of the Mongol system. In 1368, the last Yuan emperor fled Beijing. The greatest land empire in history had lasted less than a century in China. The new Ming dynasty abolished paper money and wouldn't trust it again for nearly 500 years. They turned inward, closing the borders and rebuilding the Great Wall. The era of the global Silk Road was over. The fall of the Mongol Yuan dynasty is more than just a history lesson. It is terrifyingly modern. It proves that while a state can create an infinite amount of money, it cannot create infinite value. Genghis Khan conquered the world on horseback. His grandsons lost it with a printing press. History often repeats itself, and understanding the past might just be the best way to prepare for the future.